much. It's an honor to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I'm really happy to stand here also because this room is just really beautiful. So even if this goes horribly wrong, I can tell at home to my husband that I was able to stand in the Académie, the Médecine. Pretty cool. Today I would like to talk about pragmatism. We've heard a lot of very interesting things, but I would like to focus on how are we going to implement this, or how are we going to create advice for applied research to implement all this advice. And I would like to give you a little bit of background about my own angle, because I think it will help you understand why I sort of chose to highlight certain things and not other things. So my background is in psychology. I studied psychological methods, and then I did a PhD in meta-research, but with a strong focus on social sciences and psychology. I am part of the Meta Research Center in Tilburg University, and my research is pretty broad. I focus on all kinds of things related to meta-research, so I'm more like a generalist and a specialist, I would say, as you will probably see later on in this talk. So to start with something fun and uplifting, we have a crisis. And some of you may know, some of you may not know, but especially in psychology, this has been a huge topic in the media as well, but also in science itself. And I have the feeling, by the talks that we've seen today, that in the medical research, this is also a pretty similar problem that we're facing. So things are not replicating. It turns out that there's a lot of flexibility in data analysis. Things are not shared. There's publication bias. The whole building is burning. But so for psychology, when the replication crisis broke, it was around 2011, I think, when a lot of attention was gained for this topic. And luckily, since then, a lot of solutions have been proposed. A lot of solutions. And I would like to sort of go over a couple of these solutions with you, very practical solutions, solutions that can be implemented by the researchers themselves, which is good news. So I'll go over a few of the solutions that have gained a lot of traction in psychology. I'd be happy to learn afterwards if this is actually familiar for the people who have a more of a medical background, or whether this is very specific to psychology. My impression is that most of the things I'm going to tell you are probably relevant for everyone who's doing any form of applied research. But some of the things that have been suggested are, for instance, transparency. And especially in psychology and the social sciences, these badges are extremely popular. You can earn badges for sharing your data, for sharing your materials, for pre-registering your study. And it sounds a bit like getting a sticker on your paper when you did a good practice. Well, I can tell you, you don't want to be the only one without a sticker. So we're focusing on transparency. We should share our data, we should share our materials, in order for people to be able to reproduce our work, like computationally reproduce, but also to be able to replicate it. And we need to pre-register to make sure that we get a clear split between confirmatory and exploratory. This has been taken up quite a lot already. Talking a little bit more about pre-registration, so this is probably for the more medical people among you, maybe not that much of a new thing. I can tell you that in psychology, it kind of is. It's only quite recent that pre-registration has sort of played a bigger and bigger role in research, and people started registering their work. Well, for you guys, it's probably clinicaltrials.gov. I'm trying to sort of get a medical angle here. It's highly likely that I will say some things that you're like, what? But in psychology, we are trying to sort of keep up with this registration. In psychology, one of the things that have been developed is something called a registered report. Now, I don't know how familiar, can I actually see some hands? Who of you are familiar with the term registered report? All right, who is not familiar with this term? This is also something I do with my students to see like how many people do not raise their hand. Yeah. All right, so what the idea is of a registered report is sort of an advanced version of a pre-registration where you write up your analysis plan and your hypotheses, basically your introduction and your method section, and you send that in to a journal for peer review, where the reviewers will comment on your plans and actually give feedback at the moment where it matters, so you are still able to change your plans rather than after the fact where you can't do anything about it anymore. And the key strength of this proposal is when the reviewers think your analysis plan is good and your hypotheses have a good background, then they will give you an in-principle acceptance. which means that if you carry out your research the way that you promised you would, it will get accepted regardless of the results. Now, I think this is, yeah, it sounds like if I try to explain these things to my first year students, they're just sort of staring at me blankly. It's like, yeah, but this seems normal. This is revolutionary, I think. So this is really, really great. And then if we even go one step further, there's even such a thing called registered replication reports, where researchers can file a proposal to replicate an important study in psychology. This plan, this protocol is reviewed, and then a number of teams are collected. It's a multi-lab collaboration to actually perform that registered replication. Well, this is pretty good news, and a lot of these have been, quite a few of these have been executed already, and I think this is probably the standard of research we should aim for. So this is really great news. So these multi-lab collaborations, I feel like they're pretty familiar, so they're pretty centered in genetics, I think. Who of you would say that they often, or that they, who of you have ever participated in a multi-lab collaboration? Who of you have never participated in a multi-lab collaboration? Who of you who does not want to answer my question? So these multi-lab collaborations, I think in genetic studies, they arose to make sure that the results were robust. In psychology, this was a pretty new concept. Until a couple of large projects were arising. So we have, for instance, a series of many lab projects. We have many labs, 1, 2, 3, up until 4 or 5 right now, I think, where several labs worldwide are looking at the same question or a set of questions to say something about replicability of findings and heterogeneity in these findings, etc. We now have the Psychological Science Accelerator, where democratically a research question is chosen in order to set up a multi-lab collaboration with countries all over the world. We have something called Study Swap, and I think the inventor of this, Chris Chartier, once called it Tinder for scientists, where you can, yeah, I'm not sure if he's happy that I'm saying that right now, but the idea is that if you run a study in psychology in a lab, then often participants can get credit for an hour of being your participant. And they're in a lab and they're doing some computer tasks, and it's highly likely that your task only lasts for 20 minutes, which means that you have 40 minutes of time left where your participants can, yes, still do something. Well, maybe someone else on the other side of the world has the same situation, but doesn't get enough participants. Well, then maybe you can help each other and run each other's experiment in that time slot that you have left. That's the basic idea of Study Swap. And these registered replication reports, again, also multi-lab collaborations that are happening in psychology right now. A whole different direction of trying to improve replicability and robustness of results has to do with statistics, and we've talked a bit about this as well. There is a lot of debate around frequentist statistics, around null hypothesis significance testing. I probably don't need to tell you. This debate is also being held in psychology. And there are some steps, concrete steps being taken to deal with this, to improve our statistical inference. One of the things is, for instance, free online courses that talk about the pitfalls of null hypothesis significance testing and how to deal with uncertainty in your data. There is a book called The New Statistics by Jeff Cumming. Here he is hugging a foam p-value. What you do not see here is that he later will throw it away. I wish I had props as well. I think it's really cool to do that. But he is really focusing on, we should move away from p-values and focus more on estimation confidence intervals. Well, we've talked about redefining statistical significance. I think this is already an outdated reference if I just heard the talk that we just had. And there is also a lot of movement towards Bayesian statistics. And one of the key accelerators in this is that software is now being made available and a lot easier for psychologists who usually have relatively little statistical training to be able to, do Bayesian statistics on a platform that looks very familiar to SPSS, so it feels safe. To even sort of make it more straightforward and simple, one of the things I've developed, for instance, is called StatCheck. It's a spell checker for statistics, if you will. What it does is you feed it an article, it will scan the text for null hypothesis significance tests, and it checks whether the reported p-value matches the degrees of freedom in the test statistic. This may sound trivial, but I can tell you that in psychology, half of the papers have at least one p-value that doesn't match up with the rest of the numbers. So this is extremely easy to implement. And all these statistical sort of tools that I've just described are very practical ways to improve your inferences to a more or less extent. Then people have talked about open publishing practices. You should publish open access in order for people to have access to your results. And if that's not possible, because maybe you don't have the funding, maybe you can publish a preprint online. And this is actually also an interesting poll. So in some fields, preprints are extremely normal, and in other fields they are unheard of. So in the sort of the, let's do just a poll without any sort of conditionals on it. Who of you posts preprints regularly of your work? Who of you doesn't? Yeah, so it's a bit of a 50-50 or a bit of a 25-25 and unknown. This is a sort of a way to to share your work with the world before sort of entering the whole publication process. It's also a way to make your work openly available even while publishing in a closed access journal. And of course, there are also like completely new publishing platforms being developed right now, such as F1000 Research, for instance. And there is much, much more. So this is just sort of a bird's eye view of all the different types of concrete, practical implementations that researchers can use to improve their research. So this is pretty great, I would say. We're already we're reaching this ideal world where everyone can do all these things to improve their work. And actually, I would like to take this moment to also say that in the posters in the hallway, I saw plenty of more examples of research that could be in this list as well. There's a lot of development going on right now and a lot of really good news. So why do you maybe sense that there's going to be a but in this talk? Because I think there are some pitfalls that we have to deal with in order to make sure that researchers take up all these solutions. The first pitfall is the following. You're a researcher and you've heard of all these things and you feel like, okay, I want to do this because, this is what it is to do good research. And you're sitting there and you're thinking, okay, so I have to pre-register my Bayesian sequential power analyses on my openly available, perfectly archived data that you collected with many labs while riding a unicorn. Things can become really overwhelming really fast. At least this is the sense that I have when I talk about these things, when I try and present these things, when people who are very willing to change their practices go to conferences like this, hear 1,000 of things they can implement in their research, become completely overwhelmed and sort of walk away with, yeah, you know what, if I want to be an open scientist, I have to do these thousands of things. I don't know these things. Maybe this is hard for me. You know what, never mind. And that, to me, would be such a waste. That would be so sad. If people feel like, well, I cannot perfectly implement all these things, so you know what, I'm just going to leave it. So I think this is one pitfall, that people get overwhelmed. Another pitfall, I think, is that these things are sometimes presented as a one-size-fits-all. And I think that that is maybe not entirely true. So for instance, not every solution works for every researcher in every project. And this can be like to a very detailed level. Like if I want to be a researcher, I usually post preprints online. But for one particular project, I couldn't because then the journal I wanted to submit to would make a problem out of it. So it's not like if I can implement things as a researcher, that means that I can always do it. For another example that we've talked about actually already quite a lot, data sharing and the importance of it. And so I think in the end that should be our goal always, data sharing. But to have something as your goal and to always do it are two different things. And especially, I guess, with most of the people who work with medical data, there are some very serious privacy and ethical issues concerned around that. So things might not always be as easy as they sometimes sound. Same thing holds for instance, these many-labs collaborations. They sound really great, but what if you need a super specific population for your research question? Then maybe that research is not very suitable for a multi-lab collaboration. So one size does not fit all. Every researcher, every project can have different specifications that might make things easier or harder. And the third main pitfall that I see with all these, presenting all these solutions is this guy, the supervisor. Dum, dum, dum. Especially for young researchers, and I feel like it's the young researchers who are most enthusiastic about all these implementations, who are most willing to change their methods, because they don't have like fine, completely ingrained methods, the way that they do things. They're still flexible, they're trying out new things, and these open science practices fit in perfectly with that. But maybe their professor will tell them, we're aiming to get into science, so keep removing outliers until you get that p smaller than 0.05. This may sound exaggerated, and I am very sad to tell you that it's not. I've heard several instances where PhD students were like literally advised to fish in their data until something interesting popped up in order to write that up. Maybe your professor will say, we've worked so hard for these data, I'm not going to share them with anyone. I want to have the credit. These are my data, we own them. Or maybe they say, pre-registration is for methodological terrorists. This was a huge scandal, by the way, in psychology, where a very important professor called meta-researchers like methodological terrorists. So it's an interesting story. So, we sometimes live in the real world and we have restrictions imposed sometimes upon us by our supervisors or our boss. So, what is the solution to this? I think there's different ways to approaching it. I think there's, in the end, top-down solutions where some things just become, obligatory. Funders might require things, institutions might require things. But I think one of the most important things we can do as researchers ourselves is to not be so hard on ourselves. And that's why I would like to propose cherry picking that is allowed. I would like to propose to cherry pick what works for you. Cherry pick the open science method, the tool that you want to use to improve your research. Just pick whatever you like. This is also sometimes been called the buffet approach. If you want to eat 7 of those triangle sandwiches, go for it. So what I hope a strategy like this will get to is that it convinces researchers that it doesn't have to be hard to do these open practices. And I think a lot of the barriers that people are facing to, that stop them from implementing these new things is that they're a bit afraid, like they don't completely understand how things work, which is logical because they have never done it before. And the reaction might be, then never mind. Whereas with this, just pick the thing that you feel like you're maybe slightly familiar with. And then see, maybe it wasn't so hard after all. Or maybe, I can improve the second time I'm doing this. And maybe the second time I can add 1 extra practice to it because now I'm getting the hang of it. This strategy will also, hopefully, allow researchers to improve their research practices regardless of the type of research that they're doing. So what I often hear is that people who are, for instance, working in the field of sexuality or other very sensitive fields that work with sensitive questions or sensitive data, is that they immediately seem to say, well, all these open science things, they're not for us because what we are doing is so sensitive. And I understand the reflex, but if you see the lists and lists of practices that are being developed, then there must be something that you can implement in your sensitive projects as well. Finally, what I hope this strategy will achieve is that it allows junior researchers to sneak good practices through the back door. If your professor tells you, pre-registration's out of the question, then I would like to take a pragmatist stance. Like on the one hand, you can say, you should sort of stand up for yourself and sort of force your supervisor to let you pre-register or something. That might work in some cases to hold your ground. I also think that you might run the risk of becoming too difficult and getting fired. And this may be too bleak. I don't know. I don't have any data on this. But what I would find really sad is that the people the junior researchers who want to implement open science and try and stand up against their supervisor to get their good science published, that in the end those people might disappear from science. So what I think a good compromise could be is, like, while you're still closely supervised, try and get as much of the open practices in your research, the ones that maybe your supervisor doesn't have strong feelings about. So if your supervisor has strong feelings about not sharing your data, post a preprint online. You know, stat check your paper to make sure there are no errors in that. A lot of these things can probably be implemented anyway. What I really try to convey, and what my main point of this entire talk is one, there are very many ways to improve your research. And especially for you guys, because you know, all the solutions that I've listed are probably not new and are probably already implemented in your own work. But it's really about how to convey these things to people who might not be very familiar to it. And I think that a really good way to do so is to, you know, invite them to cherry pick whatever they would like. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, and we have time for a few questions.
Thanks for your talk, very nice. I agree with most of you what you said. I got a bit nervous when you mentioned SPSS as a role model for JASP, because I think what's also important is dynamic reporting, like implemented in Nitter and Markdown. And so we actually try to get away from SPSS, and some people argue this is actually maybe one cause of the reproducibility problem, that people, you know, click and drag. And so what's your view on this?
I'm not sure if I would call it the cause, but I do think dynamic reporting is really, really great. So if I would have to, like, pick a place to start to improve research practices, I would aim first at computational reproducibility. Because if a paper is not computationally reproducible, if the numbers that I see in the paper, that I cannot see the link with the raw data and these numbers, then it doesn't make sense to try and replicate these numbers with new data, because I can guarantee you that these same numbers will not roll out, because they didn't roll out with the original data anyway. So this is, and this relates to just, you know, checking whether things add up, the basic requirements. You can argue about a lot of things, but I would challenge you to argue this idea that it doesn't really matter if numbers are correct in a paper. So one way to guarantee at least sort of consistency in your statistics is flexible reporting. What's the term you use? Dynamic reporting. Thank you. The only problem I see with that is, again, pragmatic. So psychologists, like I deliberately said SPSS, because that's simply the statistical program that most psychologists work with. We're slowly moving to R, which is already somewhat better, because you need to understand a bit of the workings of the statistics that you're using as compared to SPSS, where you just can click on things. Two things I think would help is either trying to make the dynamic reporting more user-friendly. There are some directions to do that, because dynamic reporting, for the people who are unfamiliar with it, who's unfamiliar with dynamic reporting, by the way? Yeah, so dynamic reporting basically means you're writing plain text and interweave that with blocks of analysis code, and then you press a button, and then it sort of like knits it together in a nice document, but all the numbers that are in the documents directly came from your analysis code. So this makes sure that the statistics in your paper are consistent with your data. So there's no typos possible, there's no sort of mismatching different kinds of statistics. So my spell checker, stat check, would not flag anything, because everything would be internally consistent. So that would be really great to try and develop that more, so that's more user-friendly. I still do think that programs like JASP, like the Bayesian statistical program that make things easier to use, will help to some extent, and also from a pragmatic point of view. Like right now, we're trying to maybe get people, or at least the people who develop JASP, are trying to get people away from the p-value more towards the base factor. And I think if you want to achieve that, then making it as easy as possible is probably a good approach. But yeah, I definitely take your point that it might be risky.
Thank you. Do we have other questions? Yes, Katie.
Thanks very much for your talk. I wanted to ask you, so your talk was a lot about young researchers, but how can we shift the responsibility on senior researchers as well? How can we share this together?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And the interesting thing is that often when I hear senior researchers talk about these things, that they're all about, you know, we need to train our PhD students, and then almost like we need to train our senior researchers. Because I think that the junior researchers have a lot of the right intuitions, and then the seniors are more like, well, you know, we've done this like this for years, and the only way to get published is to do this. And that might not be intentional, it might not be coming from a bad place or anything, but I do think a lot of the old traditions need to go away to make place for sharing data. And to do that, you need to let go of a lot of things that have worked for you for very many years. So how do we do that? Well, to be honest, I've always been in a very privileged position that the people I've worked with were already very much into this. I think as a PhD student, you can sort of try and educate your supervisor by showing them little things. Maybe, what is it? Ask for forgiveness, not for permission. When you've already posted a preprint online. So you have to be a little bit careful with these things, because I don't know who the supervisor is. So that's one thing, like try and educate them from the bottom up. I also do think that institutions play an important role in the sense that, for instance, in my faculty, it's now obligatory to share data, not necessarily publicly, but in such a way that other people from your university can access it. So that's just like an imposed rule. Funders are requesting data sharing and are sort of also like, it's not necessarily all sticks, there's also carrots in the sense that some funding schemes also provide funding to publish open access. So in the end, it's probably going to have to be a balance from both bottom up and the top down. But I definitely think that the young researchers play a large role in educating you.
Please, Else.
May I just be allowed to differ on the ask for forgiveness issue? Go sneakily doing something which you haven't agreed on, and then afterwards, I would really be very disappointed if that was the way things happened. I would hope there's a trust position between supervisor. After all, it's often joint work, and I would really want it to be agreed and not afterwards, oh, by the way, we've done things against your will. It's just my old-fashioned, old view.
I know that's a really fair point, and I mean the ask for forgiveness, ask for permission is of course a little bit of an exaggeration. What I mainly mean with that is not necessarily immediately, especially if you know that your advisor is against something, then it's a whole different story. If you have the feeling that your advisor might be somewhat skeptical towards all these new things, like new things in general, then what might be worth doing is already preparing your open science strategy. So maybe, for instance, psychology, we use a lot of the open science framework, where you can archive and share all kinds of things, like from your hypotheses to your materials to your data. And you can keep these pages private until you click publish. What I can imagine is if you already show your advisor that you've made like a nicely documented, well put together page, then your advisor can they only have to give the okay then, rather than you coming to them and saying, hey, I want to share my data, and they might say, well, that's very difficult, and how are you going to do that, and seeing all kinds of problems that you may have already solved. But yeah, still, I definitely take your point, being careful with this. And again, all my advice here is speculative, because I have never had to face these issues.
Thank you. So with that, we'll conclude this.